Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Windy Harbour Research Seminar. Today we have a live panel to answer your questions about our fantastic late Mesolithic Neolithic transition site in Lancashire. My name is Clemency Cooper and I'm the Community Manager for Oxford Archaeology, and I'm your host for today with the panel. I'm going to be monitoring the questions and answers that come through today's session. You can submit questions using the Q&A panel. So if you have questions to ask live, then please put them into there and they will become apparent to our panel and we'll answer those as we go along. We also have all of the questions that you have submitted in advance during your registration and with our form. If you have any comments to share, then please put those into the chat, but please ensure that any questions that you would like the panel to answer go into the Q&A. Thanks very much. I'll now pass over to Chris Gosden, who is our chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Clemency. And this is, as Clemency said, a follow-on from the presentation that happened a little bit over a week ago on Windy Harbour. And we've had a series of questions that have already come in. But really, if you want to post a question during the session, then we'd really welcome that. We've got an expert panel which are composed of people who've been involved in the site in various different ways. So they're Fraser Brown, Antony Dickson, Helen Evans and Denise Druce, who have expertise in various aspects of the site and its analysis. And then we have people who are expert in the periods, but haven't been involved in the site. And they are Chantal Conneller, Alison, Sheridan and Alasdair Whittle are here with us today. My name's Chris Gosden and I'm here just to try and keep things moving. So welcome everyone and do, oh, and sorry, and Richard Peterson, I forgot for some reason, I forgot Richard. I'm really sorry about that. Richard's there as well. So yeah, I'm just here to keep things moving. Maybe to kick off while we're waiting for people to get questions in, we could start with one of the questions that came in earlier. And there was a broad question about, well, there's a number of questions about trees. People are obviously interested in trees. And there was a particular question about tree throws. So trees that have fallen over are well known in the early Neolithic period and are often made a bit of a fuss of. But these also occur in the Mesolithic in this site. And I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on the nature of those things and the possibility of some sort of continuity across the Mesolithic, early Neolithic boundary.
I think we do have some ideas about that, and it's interesting as well because we've just had a question coming in from David Kay, which he says, I live about half a mile away from the site. What would the surrounding landscape have looked like during the period? So I think that kind of feeds into that as well. And maybe we could put that over to Denise, because we have palynological evidence, that's pollen evidence of what the woodland looks like. And you've done work on the environment. So maybe you could chip in here, Denise, please.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's early days, but certainly from the evaluation, I mean, if we're looking at the period of time contemporary with the activity, certainly during the earlier Neolithic, it looks like it's a woody landscape. Most of the evidence so far looks to be primarily quite open woodland with a lot of alder. So it was wet in places and hazel, of course, we've got lots of hazelnuts. Not so much direct evidence for oak, funnily enough, other than charred oak. So I think we think, you know, oak trees would have existed somewhere. And of course, most of the prostrate trunks we found were oak. So it could be that oak woodland was a different time period, from a different time period. But we've yet to get the dendro dates for the oak trunks, haven't we, Fraser, I think? So yeah. And also we've got evidence from the pollen from the boreholes, of course, and that gives us a very long period of landscape history, which Mairead Rutherford will be bringing forward to fruition during the analysis. And I think it looks as though that, you know, we have got late Paleolithic, early Holocene pollen evidence. So we'll be picking up sort of fluctuations in relative sea level, and all the changes in the local environment that were introduced. And I think Fraser picked up to it at the very end of the conversation during the last seminar that, you know, at one point there was evidence for a transgression. I think that was that slightly before the Neolithic, or it's late Mesolithic transgression, and that could tie into when we were getting the Phragmites. So it's early days, but you know, we are going to have very hopefully a very detailed picture of what the landscape would have been like during the occupation moving forward.
And Denise, just to pick on this again, Andrew Holmes put a question forward, and he's a specialist from Warwick University, and he's particularly interested in ancient woodland. So you might be better placed than I to answer it because it's quite technically phrased. It's thinking about the environment of the site. You mentioned straight grown oaks about 200 years old, i.e. the age of the oak trees rather than them being 200 years ago. I was wondering if you see a difference between the Mesolithic and Neolithic woodland, and whether you see the woodland as a Vera type open mosaic in the Mesolithic or a more traditional classic climax forest.
All very interesting questions, and ones which I can't answer right now, I'm afraid. Again, you know, once we've got all the samples back and the pollen analysis is going ahead, these are exactly the sort of questions we will be looking at, you know. And I like the idea of the Vera type open mosaics, and of course that will tie into positive evidence for clearance and the like. So moving forward, you know, these are all questions we will be answering, hope to be answering. But as I say, right now, you know, given we have very limited dating, it's very difficult to pinpoint any particular specific habitats to specific times right now.
Right. And I don't know whether any of the broader panel members have any thoughts on this at all. Alasdair.
Well, one thought is that, and I'm not an expert in this, but I just sort of refer the discussion group to is there are increasingly sophisticated ways of thinking about how to interpret pollen data, and this could be a really interesting opportunity. One that we worked with in a recent project is called the multiple scenario approach. And basically it's a Bayesian approach to doing multiple reconstructions of vegetation and vegetation sequences. We published a couple of papers on it, one about the Somerset levels and moors, and the other, well, that isn't out yet, but it's forthcoming, about Orkney. So, and there are other applications elsewhere. So, that gets quite technical, and you have to get in touch with the palynologists who know how to do this. But rather than just sort of old-fashioned single site and projection from raw pollen counts, you can get into more sophisticated and multiple interpretations of sort of cloaking the vegetation, and when you go through a sequence, as you've got so spectacularly at Windy Harbour. It could be really, really interesting.
We'll have to pick up the details for that, Alasdair.
Yeah, I could. Well, if you send me an email, I'll send you some links to that.
Alison, is the sort of stuff sorry, I was going to say, is that the sort of stuff that Nikki Whitehouse has been doing?
I don't know I offhand whether she's done that. We worked with Michelle Farrell at Coventry and Jane Bunting at Hull University.
Yeah, thank you.
But I think others are involved. As I say, I'm not a technical expert in that myself.
I saw some people speaking about some of the approaches at the Newcastle Landscape Conference, and it looked really interesting. So, I mean, just to pick up on the succession, what Mairead, our palynologist, has identified from the course so far is that the primary sort of early Holocene woodland, around about 8,200 Cal BC, is oak and hazel dominated with an ash presence as well. And then it's that's after the usual sort of grass and juniper succession you get immediately post-glacial, as far as you can understand. And then there's an elm decline, I think, as I mentioned last time, which happens relatively early. It seems to be earlier than our evidence for domesticates coming into the landscape. So it could be driven by environmental factors such as rising sea level or storminess or something like that, rather than people, perhaps. And then by the time we've got our inverted commas Neolithic sites there, it seems to be a salt marsh environment. So, but with the evidence Denise has picked up is things like willow leaves, elm leaves, holly leaves. We've got multiple instances of mature oak trees, and then weed seeds such as. So I think at least we're looking at some mature woodland and then some more open environment, woodland edge, giving way to sort of salt marsh in the floodplain. So that's our baseline to elaborate from.
So the complicating factor with these sites is the movement of the sea, the various marine transgressions, which will change the environment quite considerably. Yeah. David Kay has a very good question, which I'm sure we would all struggle to answer, but it is a good question. How far from the site would people have travelled to hunt in the surrounding areas? I don't know if any of the team have any thoughts on that.
I mean, Chantal, maybe you must have read all sorts of people's theories on this, and you know where we are.
Well, I think a lot of stuff would be quite local and in those sort of rich landscapes. But there is evidence from various sites of perhaps things being jointed and then moved, perhaps sort of preserved as snacks and moved sort of further around the landscape. But it's very difficult to tell. It sort of depends a bit on. It depends a bit on how sort of hunter-gatherer sort of seasonal rounds are set up. Some people use up all the resources in the local area, and so much of the stuff is reasonably local, and they shift their camp much further. Other people have much more organised ways of dealing with the landscape. You might get groups moving quite a lot further, perhaps on a seasonal basis, and returning to a sort of more central camp. And then you might get things moving much further. Obviously, a lot of these animals are quite heavy, so they need to be sort of prepared and jointed and brought along. So a lot of stuff will probably be local-ish, and lots of traps and things set up and snares. But again, it's very difficult to tell, and it depends on, I think, fitting these sites into their sort of broader landscape pattern, which is quite a long and complex thing, and based on post-excavation and how all that things such as sourcing and how that relates to nearby sites, which will be a fun thing for Dick and Fraser to do for later on.
But we're likely to be looking at a highly sort of structured, patterned use of the landscape, aren't we? That people would have known what was where, broadly speaking. And
yes. So if we look ethnographically, these sort of broader, very structured models don't work all the time. There are quite a lot of local decisions, fission, fusion, a couple going off for a week, perhaps because something's happened there and then. So there's a lot of contingent decisions as well. But people do know these landscapes. They know their affordances very well, and they make very good use of them.
Right, thanks. Can I take you all back to the question that you totally avoided, which is the one of tree throws, and both the nature of the tree throws and the possibility of some sort of continuity between. Yes, Chantal.
Well, I'm not so sure I can talk about continuity, but I'm sure some of my other colleagues can do. But I can talk about Mesolithic use of tree throws. I mean, there certainly is. There's a variety of things going on with tree throws. Obviously, quite a lot of them happen after settlement, and material sort of silts into those. So they're good capture points for finding Mesolithic archaeology particularly if the buried soils and land surface aren't preserved. But there do seem to be definitely instances of Mesolithic groups using tree throws. So one of the sort of structures, one of the pits at Broomhill, one which has a characteristic tree throw banana shape, has a hearth in it. Similarly, Chris Evans has suggested in his classic the classic paper on the tree throw suggests one of the Farnham pits has been modified. One of the Abinger, again, those sort of old pit dwellings that like to be tree throws, has posts associated with it, and there's sort of reported bletchingly there seems to be modified tree throws as well. So these things come up in the literature, things that seem to be perhaps used as middens, or have evidence such as hearths in them. So they certainly seem to be used in particular ways in the Mesolithic, though it's untangling their taphonomy can be quite difficult.
No,
we have almost every kind of tree throw at Windy Harbour. We have modified ones, we have ones that have been used as middens, we have ones that are just shadows, we have multiple tree throws from different phases cutting each other and filled in, and it's like 7 PhDs to answer that question. At this point.
And that's true of both periods, is it? Mesolithic and Neolithic?
Well, we haven't got radiocarbon dates, so in some places it's very difficult.
Yeah.
But I would say probably yes.
Right.
We have one on the confluence on site 7, which looked like it was full of Mesolithic material, and there was some microliths here and there, and there's certainly early Neolithic ones as well.
Right, okay.
And ones with no anthropogenic activity, also lots and lots of those.
Right, yeah. And what about continuity? I know everyone's going to be reluctant to tackle this question, but it's the sort of thing our audience are interested in. Silence.
One obvious question following on from that is the nature of the Neolithic material that you find in some tree throws different from the nature of the Mesolithic material that you find in others at Windy Harbour?
Yes. I'll put it back to Helen, but you're digging one up at the moment, which is very probably Neolithic, and it's full of charcoal and stone settings and smashed stone, but no real flake lithics. Where the Mesolithic tree throw we had at the site you mentioned earlier at the confluence is replete in flake lithics. And this is
how many flake lithics were in there, but it was about several hundred, wasn't it, Dick, or like 1,000 or something? You're muted.
You're muted.
Okay, let's go for 1,000.
That's a good round number.
And that was the site that the students from UCLan were digging. So Rick was about as well for that, and it was just probably the most stone tools we've ever found in one place.
We had the geomatics team over about 4 times a day to pick up finds when we were digging that, didn't we? It was just, we were constantly stealing your survey people from the rest of the site to come and record the lithics as we pick them up. So yeah, I would say that 1,000 would be a good, or 1,000 would be a good guess.
I think they're really interesting things that could be done with Mesolithic middens. I was just having a nice chat to Fraser about that, having read the amazing stuff at Stainton West. So there's really interesting middening practices, including involving tree throws as well. That's a really interesting area for future research. You can definitely do something just based on those 2 sites, which would be amazing.
Is it thought that the trees fell over because they got waterlogged and died, or because of storminess? Can you tell?
We think in one place. Well, let's just peel back a little bit. I'd say all our traditional Mesolithic sites, just to follow on from where we were before, are probably all around tree throws, and they're all they're middens of tree throws, and then we get to the more complicated sites where they're, you know, we're a bit puzzled because there's apparently Mesolithic style stuff and then Neolithic style stuff, and they're a bit more complex. But the very sort of the basic units are probably little clearances around tree throws, and then lithic scatters and hearths and things, and then the lithics ending up in the tree throws. And of course that could be human clearance. At the CNDR we found an oak tree in the Paleo Channel which had been girdled by a stone axe, and it dated to the 6th millennium. So, and then that'd fallen into the channel, and then the beavers had loved that, and they made a beaver lodge around it, and then people came back and we had lithic scatters on the beaver lodge. So we have kind of got a very direct evidence for low level Mesolithic clearance interference, which backs up the pollen records, say, in that landscape. And it's probably a similar picture at Windy Harbour. That said, we had the whole group of oak trees, very straight, long trunks, trees under stress. They'd all fallen in the same direction. They were all apparently situated on the banks of the freshwater Paleo Channel, and they're at the same stratigraphic level, as far as we can tell at the moment, without detailed chronology, as the Mesolithic / earliest Neolithic activity on the immediate banks adjacent to them. They were within peat, so peat had accumulated around them. So what we've done is taken columns of soil up through the peat sequences, which encompass directly adjacent to the trees, which encompass their, you know, the sequence they're within, and we've also they've got bark preserved in them. So that, in dendrochronological terms, should mean we'll get them aged to within 6 months of their deaths. And as far as we can tell, they all came down in one event. Now that could be a flash flood or a very heavy storm with prevailing winds from one direction. Or it could be slightly more complicated, and that's kind of what the peat suggests, in that there might have been a rise in the base water levels. Those trees were probably not really very comfortable growing in a very wet environment, which kind of suggests that it changed and they'd been inundated. That, you know, and then there might have been something cataclysmic, a catastrophe, which finally led to them all falling down. In that case, in that case, we don't think it's human. I'll pass back to Helen.
The very bottom of the sequence that Fraser's talking about is one of these grey clay layers, which seems to be evidence for a marine transgression.
Okay.
So it could be that we don't think necessarily we've got direct marine influence by the 4000 sort of Lytham 6 event, but we wonder whether we've got sort of backing up and higher sea levels, you know, like the within the freshwater and freshwater channels. So they're kind of, the tidal heads move further inland, and that's got sort of other consequent events. And so that's the case. That other places, the tree throws do seem to be human made. But again, I'd like to pull back and let Dick and Helen answer, or Denise or anyone else.
We've got two broader questions while people are thinking about. So there's one from Casper Johnson about whether there's any evidence for late upper Paleolithic or early Mesolithic activity in the site or landscape. And what do you think of the archaeological potential of the land surface that continues under the alluvial deposits to the west and the southwest?
Come on, Dick.
Still muted.
It looks like his mic's broke because he's not mute, showing he's muted, but he.
Well, I can fill in a little bit. We're in a part of the country where we've got potential. You know, if you go back, let's say 20 years and you think of Scotland, southern Scotland, there's very little LUP evidence, and there's been a whole renaissance of evidence in Scotland, which clearly shows that there's people in the late upper Paleolithic in lowland Scotland and in highland Scotland, including in the Western Isles. You know, Karen Wicks and Steve Myvan's work has shown that there's this, in the Habsburgian period, there's a continuous coastline, probably from the Western Isles of Scotland all the way to Denmark, and people are moving along that horizon. Oxford Archaeology, myself and Dick, we found a house on the Isle of Man which dates to 8,200 Cal BC, which is the same sort of age. It's early Holocene, so it's not late Upper Pal, but it's immediately afterwards, and it dates the same sort of age as similar structures over in southern Scotland and Northumbria, which seems to suggest a background human presence. But there's very little evidence in Cumbria itself. There's and Lancashire. In the caves on the Cumbrian coast, we have some evidence for late Upper Paleolithic people, and very recently Anne Clark has looked at an assemblage from Maryport, which has got a late Upper Paleolithic presence, an earlier Mesolithic presence, and then a narrow blade earlier Mesolithic presence, including the use of Langdale stone at that site. So all the hints are there. We should have it. But the problem with the west coast of England and Scotland is changing sea levels and the isostatic uplift. So there's a very complex effect that the land is rebounding as the glaciers melt, and then also sea levels change. And what that generally leads to is the lower lying areas, which might have been fertile habitats and attractive to hunter-gatherers, are often swamped and buried. So this is what we have in Morecambe Bay and say the Wyre Estuary, the Ribble Estuary, and as Chantal talked about last time, Alison Burns's work around the Formby, where you have all the footprints. So we think we've got huge potential for finding submerged, waterlogged, very well preserved late Upper Paleolithic and earlier Mesolithic landscapes here, but they're just all difficult to find. But if we could find them, they'd be amazingly preserved, a bit like the Danish examples, perhaps. So it's a massive challenge. And what's really exciting with the work Helen's been doing out at Windy Harbour is that she's found evidence for charcoal at these lower levels. Now, again, so I've spoken again. I was trying to keep quiet. I'll pass back to Helen.
I don't really know the details of what was found in the boreholes that were done before the site was excavated, but we were looking about 4.5–5 meters down. And obviously, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere near the holes that were being dug. So I was out there with a big machine with a very long arm, and we were digging out estuarine clays, and below the estuarine clays, at a depth of about the bottom of the boom of the machine, we get grab samples out, and the machine would bring the stuff up, which was various different coloured sands and peats, and we'd get grab samples of them, and so it's down there. And we've, I think Denise found some charcoal in some of it, and I don't know whether the more recent ones we've done have been processed yet, but it's too deep, really, unless you dig a very big hole.
Quite a ferocious prospect, isn't it? Yes, that's depth in unstable sediments. Martin Bell has a very good question, which I know you'll all say it's too early to say, but some sort of speculation. Why were people doing things, possibly living, at the very edge of the Salt Marsh in both the Mesolithic and the Neolithic periods? I don't know who everyone's. They obviously had
my first question is how near was the Salt Marsh? Do we know how far out they would have needed to have travelled to actually get to the Salt Marsh itself? You recall, Fraser?
Yeah, I mean, well, so if we go in the freshwater channel, if you think we've got a sequence which is till, then fluvial glacial sands, and then a buried soil, then lower peats, a thick deposit of peat which dates to the earliest Holocene. Then we have a marine clay band, which is approximately 1 meter thick, and we think that relates to Lytham 4. So it's probably accumulating in the 5th millennium, when the channel would be completely marine, and that may have accounted for all of the trees going and the elm decline. And then we have a thick layer of peat on the top of the sequence, which, where we sampled it there with the Russian auger, was 3 meters deep. And we have a radiocarbon date towards the base of that sequence, which dates to 4,700 Cal BC. So it would be immediately after Living 4. So, you know how peat forms. It starts off from the lowest point and it grows up and out and it starts to fill up the valley. But what we seem to have in that freshwater environment on the confluence is a very steep landform with peat accumulating very nearby. So there would have been quite a dramatic transition from drier conditions with woodland on it to a salt marsh environment, and that seems to have maintained for quite a long time because of the physical nature of the landform, it being very steep. So I think it'd been immediate, and this kind of touches back to one of the earlier questions. I think it was it David K asked about what resources we'd have in this environment. Well, when we're on site now, we have huge skeins of geese flying over, hundreds and hundreds of geese fly over, honking away. There'd be all sorts of avine life in all the wetlands. There would have been cetaceans in Morecambe Bay. So up until, I believe, until like the mid 19th century, sperm whale and other huge marine mammals were known in the area. I live in Morecambe. A neighbour of mine rescued a porpoise. He's in the lifeboat only last year. So there'd have been dolphins, porpoises, migrating fish, so salmon, also smelt, which is now restricted to the southern Scotland, but would used to be a massive source of food in around the Solway and the Lune and up these other rivers. So there'd have been a really good source of food from the marine resources. But as we touched upon last time, there'd have all been all the other animals and plants and things which are available in the woodlands. So hazelnuts, acorns, as you're interested in, Denise, and then aurochs, these giant cows, and deer. So I think this is why this confluence is such a attractive place, is because people can access a very wide variety of resources without having to travel very far by foot or by canoe.
It's just given it was Martin that answered the question, going back to the Gold Cliff scene, I think we didn't get any evidence for footprints or anything, did we, in the clay? Am I right? Unfortunately.
Not precisely, although we had some suspicious deposits. I think it's right to say they weren't clear. It's not like the amazing stuff at Formby where you can tell that the age, the gender, the pathology of the people.
And I'm thinking of livestock as well. I mean, were there any, obvious hoof prints or anything? Because again,
and other people have found this in other places, sort of Mark Knight's work in the Fens, for example. But it wasn't really clear. But we did have some quite puddled deposits, trampled deposits on the wetland edge, and they did have some slightly odd circular depressions. It's very hard to sort of disentangle that from the background of root disturbance from the later Oldercar, but some of them did look a bit puddled. It was just not clear cut.
And just going back to trees and things, Rick Shorting has a very useful comment. He says that Nicky Whitehouse, Phil Barrett and colleagues have picked up this early pre-Neolithic elm decline at multiple locations in Ireland as well. And I think you mentioned a possible double elm decline in this area. So that's and Rick also has just asked, given these rich resources, why is the character of the British Mesolithic in general so different from that we see in southern Scandinavia? This comes back on the back of seeing a seminar by Carl Pearson on his amazing Middle Mesolithic site at Ljungaviken on the coast of South Skåne with 50 houses and hundreds of hearths. Yeah, it was an amazing site.
Chantal, go
on. Well, it's a different place. You wouldn't expect similar sort of trajectories. I mean, there's what's interesting is Ben Elliott's work suggests there may be sort of connections between some of the late Mesolithic in Scandinavia and some of the British 5th millennium evidence in the shape of T-shaped antler axes, which are the sort of the type fossil of the Urtibula, but are actually found in Scotland. So I mean, there may be context, but I think a lot of the more recent work just suggests we're not picking up the context where we get a lot of the Mesolithic archaeology. River systems just seem very important for sort of larger Mesolithic sites, and a lot of these are quite deeply buried. I don't know why we don't have these massive shell middens. It doesn't seem such a such a sort of British thing. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think there's more context that can be found and more that we'll uncover. And I think some of the a lot of the work Oxford's been doing recently is just showing there is quite a lot of Mesolithic occupation in the 5th millennium, including some quite sort of extensively used sites. So it'll be interesting to see if those trends continue. What seems quite interesting about the sort of 5th millennium sites is they don't seem to be very sort of intense sort of structures that leave a sort of very noticeable footprint. But we know you can have quite big things like log cabins that don't really have an imprint in the landscape. So yeah, it's difficult to know. Certainly the sort of form of the evidence is a bit different, but I think more surprises will undoubtedly emerge for the late Mesolithic.
And we've got a question from Henrietta Quinnell on the survival of bone at the site, which should be reasonably easy to comment on.
Go on, Helen.
No, unfortunately not. We found a couple of bits early on, and we were like very, very excited. But it turned out they were from later contexts. What we have been doing though is doing lots and lots of sampling of all the contexts, and hopefully we'll be able to, I don't know, maybe get DNA analysis on in other ways. For humans and animals, but we will see. Yeah. I think there's a few bits of cremated bone, wasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. There was in one place on one site.
Mm.
So there were questions that were sent in on diet. So Steve Sherlock says, "Can you tell me more about food processing? I presume the lipids indicate a dairy diet. Have you any evidence of other evidence of food processing, quernstones and so on?"
I really wish Dick wasn't muted and was able to come in.
I've emailed him several times to tell him how to unmute him. He's not reading his email.
I might ring him. Dick, yeah. we have a course stone attempt. To answer Steve's question, it's really too early. We haven't even started processing the samples. We've got a skeletal framework of radiocarbon dates from the evaluation, and this is really, really early days. We're just kind of outreaching and putting the site on everybody's radar at the moment, and we'll have more to say in the coming years. The potential's there. I think we haven't got animal bones, so we're gonna have to be creative. We have to find proxies for kind of filling in those gaps, and genetics perhaps is one avenue we can look at. And the other thing which is we're wondering about is we have got a lot of coarse stones. We're very careful not to scrub them clean. So we could maybe look whether they're used for processing things like ochre, as we saw at the CNDR, or
I think Dick can speak now, Fraser.
Yay! Brilliant, Dick, answer.
Oh.
So in lieu of Dick,
no sign language.
yeah, no, that'd be good.
So we think the stones might also be used for polishing coarse stone tools. But of course, they could be for processing foodstuffs, whether that's used to grind down seeds, as in the emmer wheat we found, or possibly things like the acorns or the hazelnuts as well to make flour or pottage or something from. So we're wondering whether lipids analysis and possibly phytoliths might be one avenue of research with that regard.
And we're also, you know, we've got a lot of processing samples to do, so we will be looking out for, you know, food residues across the board really. So yeah, if it's there, hopefully we'll find it.
We had some very interesting and very gratefully received approaches in the week with some advice. So, for example, Petra Dark got in touch and mentioned looking for parasite eggs, which is certainly something our palynologist Mairead's been looking at already. She's looking for things like whipworm and the midden we have in the Neolithic / Mesolithic settlement. It is really interesting in that regard, because we could find that we've got horizons which extend backwards from the house horizon, as it's called, around about 3,800 back into the later Mesolithic period potentially. So looking at the profiles of parasite eggs up that sequence might indicate, firstly, if we've got any proxy evidence for domesticates, but also we were speaking to Hans Schroeder from Copenhagen, and he's been able to sequence DNA from pitch tar gums from Denmark and from Switzerland. So actually, where they haven't got faunal remains or osteological remains of people, he's been able to sequence DNA actually from the resin people have chewed. And in one case, he forwarded the paper, they're actually able to determine it was a female hunter-gatherer who chewed this resin, which is amazing. You know, that's absolutely amazing. So it's a huge long shot. We're probably highly aspirational. We're probably totally overreaching ourselves, but we're open to the new technology which is coming. You know, could we potentially sequence human DNA from gut parasites? That's just an interesting thing to put out there.
Yeah. No, fantastic.
May I add one thing, please?
Yes.
Coprostanols are also incredibly valuable for as a proxy for the presence of domesticates, and that feeds into this question, which I think Rick Schulting mentioned, about salt marsh grazing. Because if the area was used during the Neolithic as a rich grazing site, as well as being a rich ecotone where they were doing hunting and gathering and foraging, as well as their domesticated activities, so I'd highly recommend coprostanols.
Thank you, Alison. I mean, and just to say, even today it is a very much a salt marsh farming landscape. I can walk a mile from my house and pick samphire. You know, it's that kind of sort of environment today. So it would have been rich in the past for that regard.
And there's a question just come in. Given the dynamic nature of the depositional environments, can you really be sure that the Mesolithic plant remains with Neolithic material are representative of closed contexts? Or is there any danger of mixing? And are you going to get dating from both the hazelnuts and the cereals to try and sort this out?
I'll jump in again. There's always mixing up and down archaeological horizons. I mean, we've seen it in multiple sites. Particularly with lithic sites, you get like almost a slow underground explosion where things tend to move up and down, but they don't move so far to the sides. But we're very fortunate in this landscape in that we have quite a simple, really generic sequence of deposition, and in some instances it seems to be very fast, very, very rapid. This is what's so exciting about the context of discovery of the apparently Mesolithic flint work with apparently Neolithic material on top of it, in that all of it sealed about 1.5 meters below ground surface, and that there's about 1 meter of peat on top of that. So the taphonomy isn't quite such an issue. And then because the base geology is quite sandy, there's been some very rapid sandy deposits, some of them quite thick as well. Yay! So that's given us a very episodic sequence of deposition where things have gone down quickly, they're associated with charcoal, and we've been very careful in how we recover the charcoal and its associations with materials. Then they're buried very rapidly by a deposit of sand. Then a layer of peat accumulates on top of it. Then there's another rapid deposition of sand, and then there's huge amounts of peat. So it's brilliant. We've struggled with compromise archaeological context for years, and this is just absolutely perfect. It's not to say there can't be some mixing, but I think we've got enough material and enough places to look that if we're very selective, we can get ideal deposition contexts where we can.
Yeah, I mean, added to that, I think I think you're very fortunate you didn't get a lot of a mix in from root action as well. You had very little, didn't you? I think, and I think there was a discussion about lumped meadows in the last seminar, and I think I'm quite surprised having all that peat and all that wood evidence for woodland that you didn't get more mixing. Actually, it's incredible how in situ everything is, certainly.
Particularly in the paleochannel next to the promontory, where we have a deposit which is 1.5 meters down, and it's buried by about 20 centimeters of rapidly accumulating material, a band of peat, then about half a meter of sand, and then about a meter of peat. So any of the older cart development, that peat, the upper peat's probably in the Neolithic period. So where there is older car and rooting coming down, it's much higher up. So it's not touching it. So I don't know, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but at the moment it looks really, really hopeful. And I'm really glad Dick can speak, because he's put so much effort and work over the last 9 months to this site. I hope he can chip in with some more of his wisdom.
Yeah. Well, there's some specifically artifact questions which I've been reserving. So there's one about the Langdale axes. Are you able to tell if the polished axes were flaked, remodeled, and then deposited? Oh yes, whether they've been used before they were flaked and remodeled.
Okay. Can you hear me clearly? Yes.
Loud and clear.
Brilliant. The axes are very interesting. They're all been broken, damaged, burnt, and what have you. But prior to that happening, it looks as though quite a few of them have had quite hard lives. Evidence for polished out flake scars, asymmetrical cross sections, and what have you, suggests that there's been quite a lot of reworking of them. Interestingly, I was just thinking about this last night. We don't have much in the way of ends of axe in terms of the cutting edge. There seems to be an attempt to get rid of the cutting edge prior to them being deposited in the wetlands or in tree throws, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And there is some evidence for actually what looks to be like they're de-skinning them, if you like, by removing the polished surface. That's usually done from a fresh break or a break. They snapped the axe in two or broke it in two and then started to remove the outer polished surface. We've also had quite a few axe flakes themselves recovered from wetland deposits, which sort of hints at that they might. We have one lot, quite a discrete group from area 2, which is near the settlement area, up in area 1, and they were quite discreet and suggest maybe they were in some kind of bag or something and thrown into the wetlands. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence for them being used, but the nice thing about them is that they seem to be decommissioning them, giving them a really good seeing off and throwing them into wetland deposits. So really interesting stuff.
That's amazing. That question was from Sally Taylor, who also had another good one, which is that your dates from early Neolithic context with Langdale axes seem contemporary with the new dates from Langdale itself. Have you any thoughts or comments on that? First of all, is that true, and then what do you think of it if it is?
Well, yeah, the axes themselves seem to fit quite nicely with the dates that we have for the site, which places it around about the 3,800 Cal BC, but I'm sure it stretches back earlier than that, because one of those dates comes from top of one of the middens, and it's one of the top layers, and we've got several phases underneath that. So it'll be interesting when we do get a good suite of dates back to see how that fits in. But again, these things seem to have had a hard life. So that kind of suggests they might have been kicking about a while until they are actually got rid of into the wetland the environment. So potentially they might have been around for quite a while before that happens. It'll be interesting when we can get, as I said, no dates as of yet, but certainly interesting when we start getting those back.
No, that's great. And then there are some general questions on the artifacts. In your presentation, Dick, you mentioned things like microliths and scalene triangles. Would it be possible to explain a bit more about the different types of lithic artifacts and how they might have been used? And what is their significance in terms of dating? This is from Linda Wright, who lives in Poulton-le-Fylde.
Okay, yes, so we have technology that's diagnostic to the late Mesolithic, so that's how we kind of provide a rough date of what we're dealing with in terms of the technology, and those being diagnostic pieces such as microliths, certain ways of working cores, and the type of debitage that is produced whilst working those cores. So that can give you a rough indication of the time period that the lithics are coming from. So, as I say, for the late Mesolithic, diagnostic tool types are microliths, tiny little pieces of blade that have been reshaped into pointy things, I suppose. And once you move into the Neolithic or the early Neolithic, perhaps the technology remains the same. That's one thing I did draw attention to in my discussion on in the seminar, is that certainly for the Northwest, this site is unique because we do seem to have quite a lot of early Neolithic activity and a lot of lithics associated with that activity. And we really don't understand technological change, if there is, certainly if there is any change in what time that happens, because we just don't have these sites in that area. State and West provided a brief sort of insight. We had bits and pieces from the Paleo channel, which suggested that blade technology was still very important. And we had a lot of leaf-shaped arrowheads, which obviously they are the indicators of early Neolithic lithic technology. So one of the main diagnostic pieces that you can tell from that. So what the Windy Harbour assemblage is probably going to help us understand is that development of technology from the late Mesolithic into the early Neolithic, and how, if there is any changes in development in that technology. So really, really interesting site, really, really important in terms of understanding that change in lithic technology.
That's brilliant. And I don't know whether Alison or anyone has any sort of broader thoughts on axes or any of these. So it's not wanting to put you on the spot, but there are people who have thought a lot about these things. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think again, Windy Harbour offers a fantastic compare and contrast with the CNDR site, where you have axe heads being deposited in a much fresher state. They haven't been used to destruction, as it were. But also you're that bit further away from the source area. And Sally Taylor was very modest. She's actually doing a PhD about Great Langdale axe heads, so she knows a whole lot more about them. Yeah.
Right. Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, just to sort of build on that, the sort of wider context, and Dick knows this stuff very, very well, but if we think about the evidence we've had previously for both Mesolithic and Neolithic lithics in places like the Forest of Bowlands and in southern Cumbria and in other areas around the site, then I think this probably helps us to make sense of a lot of quite nebulous scatter assemblages, which aren't particularly diagnostic of, or traditionally diagnostic of one period or another, but having contextual material and hopefully being able to date some of that material might help to make sense of some of the things like the big assemblages that were collected up on Anglesart Moor in I think it was the 80s and 90s by Oxford Archaeology, assemblages that Rob Leedham's been working on from work in the Forest of Woodland that we did at UCLan. There's a lots of very, I wouldn't say anomalous, very undiagnostic things, lots of drift in your typologies. And I think this will help a lot with that.
And while Rick's on, we've had a question from Sam Rowe, who I'd like to give a shout out to. She's going to be the new Historic England Science Advisor for the Northwest, and she's posed a question relating to pottery to say, are there any lipid or food residues on the pottery, and how are you going to make sure that during the post-ex process that the washing of the pottery doesn't remove these residues? And I'll put this to Rick because he's seen what we're doing and he's the pot expert, or one of the very eminent pot experts. Sorry,
Alison. I should let Alison dive in as well. We both, I think, had the same response to this of excitement and frustration at the same time, with the project team doing all they can to preserve the evidence of potential, well, the multiple potential evidences that could be there in terms of lipids, in terms of charred residues, things like that. So all the pottery, as it came out of the ground, was wrapped in foil with quite a lot of soil, of the accompanying matrix accompanying the soil as well. So nobody has, and this is the thing that I found difficult on site, my immediate response is to look at it and give it a bit of try and work out what it is and where it goes on the pot and all that kind of thing. So lots of smacky hands, put it down when it was all foiled up carefully, and it stayed in that foil. So I actually only saw, I think, 3 or 4 pieces of pottery on site, because immediately they went into foil and vanished off, where they are still being cared for.
So not only is the pottery not washed, it's still encased in mud.
Yep.
So it should be pretty optimum in terms of preservation of lipids.
It's also been in the fridge. We've bought a separate fridge. It's not doing much for our green footprint, I'm afraid, but there's a fridge with it all in for residues as well.
Oh, well, that should please hopefully. There are a series of very good questions on deposition. So Chris Ellis asks, what do the speakers mean when they mention middens and middening? Are these relatively artifact-rich deposits, or are we talking about deliberate stockpiling of settlement waste? If so, for what reason? Or in-site settlement residues? Were hearths and other features present within the midden deposits?
Can I just say hi, Chris? Long time no see, but thanks for the question. It's really good. And can I get Dick and Helen to talk about it? Because we've been kind of almost arguing about this the last 2 days, because it's a fascinating point.
I can say a bit first, Helen. So middens, interested in area 1. We've got a really big, extensive midden. You can quite clearly see that it's developed over probably quite a considerable time period. We've got lenses of what look like charcoal-rich deposits, suggesting that they're moving stuff from their settlements into these middens, so possibly charred remains from hearths and stuff like that. And then they're quite often separated by quite thick layers of sand, which don't seem to contain much. We'll know better from that. So we've got a big extensive midden in one area of the tent. And then going back to what we were discussing earlier about tree throws and what have you, we have a much smaller midden, which seems to be associated with a tree throw. And from what we can see from the stratigraphy so far, and obviously we need to get some dates on this, is that's potentially an early Mesolithic, a Mesolithic midden within an association with a tree throw, which is probably also dates to the Mesolithic. And then that is overlain by another tree throw.
Can I just point out that the ones that Dick's talking about have no finds in them?
No, well, this is an interesting thing about them as well. During careful excavation of the main midden, we had very, very few visible finds, let's say, such as lithics and what have you. They were only present in the very latest layer of the midden. So that's interesting that they were leaving things at that stage. And perhaps what we were thinking is that they might be going through and being selective about the type of materials that do go into the middens in the earlier phases. So, and we do wonder if the early Neolithic settlement north of Garston Road in Area 1 in that way is related to what's happening south of Garstang Road at Area 6, and is it that they're taking their material culture, their more visible material, if you like, in terms of lithics, big chunks of pottery and what have you, and getting rid of it in another part of the landscape. And that goes back to something somebody was saying about Martin Bell, I believe, saying the Denmark site is very similar. And again, yeah, I remember reading quite recently about a site, I don't know if it's the same one, I can't quite remember the name of it, but Area 6 is a big globe of land which sticks out into the wetlands, separated by two paleo channels on either side of a spring line. And it looks as though it's the same kind of thing, lots and lots of deposition taking place. None of it makes sense as being part of a settlement per se, so very different from what's happening over the road in the northern part of the site. Helen?
Was there any charred material? Sorry.
No, go on, please.
I was going to ask, was there any charred material in the tree throws or the midden, these early ones?
So yeah, there's the earlier tree throws got lenses through it. Looks as though it's got organic and charred material in it, very fine laminated bands. And then the later one, which is probably early in the Neolithic, because it actually sits on top of the sands, as that's the white sands that divides the Mesolithic from the Neolithic activity. That's full of charcoal-rich deposits. Again, but as Fraser said earlier, no visible artifacts in terms of lithics and pottery and stuff like that, but stones. And it's cut by a pit, and one of those pits contained what looks like a grinder, so maybe something to do with processing organic materials, cereals, what have you. Those would be being deposited in the tree throw as well.
Right.
I mean, Chris, working with Cotswold and Oxford, dug up the causewayed enclosure at Tame very recently, and I think what struck us about our site to the south of Garstang Road, this promontory, that the sort of deposits we were finding in the wetlands were kind of reminiscent of the deposits you find in the ditches of causewayed enclosures at slightly later on in the Neolithic. And it almost seemed that it was this, at that time we didn't know where people were living, we're perhaps still not quite sure, but it seemed that, you know, it was these residues of people moving up, of social practices which have been selected and put into a wetland context, whereas in a causewayed enclosure they go into the segmented ditches which surround that meeting place. So there might be some similarities or precursors there.
So part of the question was whether people were just dumping domestic waste, and that seems not to be the case, doesn't it? People are sorting things out in quite a careful sort of way.
Unless you interpret the charcoal as domestic waste, I guess. You know, there is a distinction there as to where the charcoal has come from.
Yeah,
and why
but
it's there.
just sort of sweeping out a house and dumping it all in the midden, as it were.
It seems that, as people have said, that these assemblages are meaningfully constituted. And so, for someone who's recently written a book on magical thought, I mean, I think you're probably very well placed to think of the kind of social processes which might lead to how this kind of material is constituted and the kind of social process behind it, that it isn't just rubbish in inverted commas, that it's a residue of a whole social system behind it.
Yeah, no, I think in almost any period of prehistory, people are just chucking away rubbish. They're doing quite careful things in different ways. So Andrew Hone asks about this directly. You're clearly seeing differential practices around disposal. Is this votive, or is something else going on? So are you going? I mean, the votive word, the ritual words are all incredibly, but it seems like that's the way you're going.
It's really frustrating being a prehistorian, because you kind of always end up taking this kind of way out. You find you're confronted with otherness and you can't explain it from your own position, and you end up trying to find, you know, some sort of linguistic expression which makes sense in our context to try and explain it. And I struggle, you know, I don't know if votive is quite the right word, but it's one of the words which is similar in our realm of experience, which helps explain what might possibly be happening. We're dealing with a pre-literate society who are probably animist or totemistic in their outlook, and they're using the materials and the residues of their social practices to articulate those beliefs and act them out in the landscape, I guess, is what we're looking at. And then we dissolve down prehistorians navel gazing again, and it's all shut
Or
up.
we could just have definitely throwing things in watery places.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's good. That's good. That's a step forward. Yeah, yeah. I don't know whether Chantal or anyone has any thoughts on these slightly tricky issues.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. This evidence for middening comes up. It's quite difficult. It's very difficult to get hold of in the Mesolithic when you don't have faunal preservation. And Dick's done amazing work here and at Stainton West. I was reading his fantastic work on that, just identifying these. So I suspect they're much more common. But we pulled them out also at Stark. I did a lot of refitting, and there's quite a lot. There's really interesting ways material is disposed of, and it has quite different patternings. So we had a midden behind one of our structures, which was stuff that had gone in the structure being cleared out and deposited behind that. That was identified through refitting, but also had lots of much higher quantities of burnt flint and things like that. But there's also different varieties of rather more formalized deposition. So on the edge of the wetland, there was a really super dense deposit of animal bone and some broken objects, but lithics were quite rare on that, where they were the real main constituent of the middens in the on the dry land, and that the modelling suggests that was maybe even one or just a few events, something that's very short term, and that seemed to be an event. That seemed to be a memory of event, and the stuff from that event, lots of animal bone, lots of activity, it was deposited in a particular way. And then there was an early event that was much further out in the wetland and was really very formal, patterned deposition of animal remains. So there's very interesting things in different sort of materials and substances being treated in different ways at different periods, but also relating to particular events. And you sometimes get a sense with Mesolithic, some other Mesolithic deposits, that's related to events. But there's also particular periods in the Mesolithic where they seem to be really interested in putting half sweepings in pits. At the very start of the late Mesolithic, there's a real emergence of pits, and Ed Blincon's done really amazing work sort of pulling some of these out and drawing them to people's attention. But a lot of those particularly I think mainly in the sort of 8th millennium are really full of burnt material and half sweepings. So they've seen something particularly focused on transformed materials around there. So there's really interesting patterns that go on. It'll be nice to see some more of them pulled out.
And Chantal, am I right in thinking that the earliest phase at Starkar now is a potential sort of trackway leading out into the wetland formed by woodworking waste? So the debris from clearance and then leading to kind of deposition of an antler front or remains.
Yes. It's there's a bit of evidence on the dry land, and there's a sort of lot of laid down wood, not so formal as the later platforms. And yes, that's the earliest evidence, this sort of very formal arrangement of a deer, almost in a lot of it in anatomical order, but it's got two left legs basically. So it's a composite animal, and it's got 4 different heads that you can found scattered, four alternative heads, one of which is an antler frontlet. But this is sort of quite interesting. It's almost like that sort of a foundation event, because then a lot of the later activity happens in respect to that. So it's almost like a mythologizing of the sort of first occupation of the area, which is quite interesting.
And it's sites of the quality of Windy Harbour and the quality of work, both of excavation and analysis, which will allow us to talk about these things in a much richer way than we can in Starkar. But those instances are rare for a whole variety of different.
Yeah, and it's dealing with lithic material, which is really difficult to deal with, and it just needs this meticulous approach that Dick's been doing on these sites. It needs this sort of time spent on it, and the sort of work at Stainton West, huge amounts of flint. It's just absolutely amazing the work you've done on that. That's fantastic. But using this really meticulous analysis to bring out these complex patterns and get this really interesting understanding of how sites are used and middling and really nice sort of ways the site's structured, just bringing out new exciting information. I've just read this report, so I'm very excited about it. So it's really fantastic work.
Yeah. So there was a question that came in previously. So we're moving to the Neolithic for a moment or two about grain and grain processing. And again, a tricky set of questions about what they were doing with the grain. Were they making porridge, bread, or possibly malting it in some way? I know these are difficult issues, but I don't know if anybody's got any preliminary comments on any of the grain processing.
Again, early days. So far, we've discovered 3 cereal grains. So, you know, I think there's only a limited amount you can say based on the current evidence. But moving forward, you know, we will be looking for just these types of evidence. So, as I say, not just the charred remains. I'd like to find some non-charred cereals as well. That would be my dream come true. But also, you know, as I mentioned before, we'll be looking for food residues, not just for cereals, but also, you know, there's evidence to suggest acorns would have been used. And up till now, unfortunately, we've got very little direct evidence for that. I don't think in Britain, but certainly on the continent, there is evidence for the use of acorns. And, you know, they need to be cooked, I think, to be edible. So you never know. We don't know what we're going to get, but we'll be looking for it, definitely. Another avenue for research, I guess, is what I'm probably not up on the recent advances in pottery residue analysis, but is there scope for looking at pot residue to pick up plant remains as well, you know, types of plant remains?
Could I jump in here and say, yes, indeed. Simon Hamman, who was at Bristol University until recently, worked with Lucy Cramp, and they've now refined lipid analysis to such an extent that they've been able to pick up traces of both barley and wheat in Neolithic pottery from waterlogged contexts in the Outer Hebrides. So this is a very, very exciting development.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. So you can link the pots to the food for the first time.
So Denise, if you got waterlogged grain, again, could we look at gene sequencing of the grain types and then look at
that's exactly what I was thinking. You know, I think, because I believe, you know, ADNA, there are issues with charred material, I believe. But yeah, I mean, you know, if we could come across some waterlogged cereals, then yeah, you know, that would definitely be something we'd want to look into. And also for me, you know, I think, I don't know if much work's been done on ADNA of cereals. There has, but we're looking at land races and stuff as well. So I guess I'm going back to a query you had, Alison, in the actual seminar about how far were they bringing in the cereals, because we had chaff. It's a difficult one. You know, you could argue, I mean, it looks like they were probably, based on the evidence we got, and we're finding chaff, they could have been doing their final stages of processing on site. And for that, you'd probably want a half, because it's easiest to take off the hulls and the husks after they've been parched. But just because you're getting that chaff doesn't mean they didn't come in for quite a way. I think, you know, if you're transporting cereals, you could just as easily transport spikelets. So we're just looking at just the cereal grain within the glooms. You know, that could still be transported, I would have thought. But bringing in the other evidence, you know, what I'd like to find is like on similar to later sites where you get cereal processing waste alongside cereal grain, weed seeds, which can give you an indication of what the soil conditions were like where the cereals were growing. So if you bring in all this other evidence, you know, we'd be looking for it, and we'd be looking into that. So there's big scope. It's just frustrating because, you know, we don't know what we're going to get yet.
And one of those really interesting, sorry, Alison, I can't question you. I'll shut up quickly. I was just going to say, it'd be really interesting within these assemblages to look at the constituents of wild and domestic resources. So if you did get that level of preservation, when we were talking this week about club rush tubers, where they've been found in, say, Middle Eastern contexts in very early Natufian context of cereal grain, and people have been relying on gathered resources and domestic resources. It'd be great to see how that, you mentioned acorns and hazelnuts already. I'll shut up, Alice.
I was only just going to ask, yes, a lot of DNA work has obviously been done on each of the varieties of cereals and wheat and barley, and the people who know most about it are Amy Bogard and Glynis Jones.
Yeah.
Really,
those would be really sorry.
Yeah, because I was going to say they look at isotopic evidence as well.
They do.
They? So that's potential.
For later periods to find out things like manuring, they can find out whether grains have been grown with manure or not. Yeah, no, it's really quite exciting.
Again, I assume, do you need uncharred grains?
Yes. Because DNA doesn't survive when things get burnt.
Yeah. What about the isotopes? Do they survive?
Rick Shorting was online, and he might well know. I don't know is the answer. I don't know whether Rick.
Just because we've got a gap, Andy Holmes asked another question as well. I know Andy had posted on Badger this week on the and reminisced about his work, his digging at Lismore Fields. I think Daryl Garton's also perhaps registered, so hello to both of you. He's mentioned, are there any plans to try and model what the hall might look like? And I think we just have to disabuse the notion that we have a hall at the moment. We possibly do. I think we had some quite heated debate on site yesterday about various scenarios which our evidence might lend itself to, and we're not clear yet. We've still got to dig bits under the tent. But so far, we don't have evidence for one of these classic Neolithic plank-built halls. It might be we've just missed it, and we get it when we dig under the anchors of the tent. That's a viable hypothesis. But presently, we don't have one. So what we possibly have is a much more sort of bivouac or hut type structure. I think Chantal mentioned Lunt Meadows last time we spoke, which is Ron Cowell's site with Liverpool Museum down in the River Alt, just to the south of us. And there's a very good website posted online which explains the archaeology they had at Lunt, and there's a lot of potentially similarities between what we found at Lunt and what we've got at Windy Harbour. But in terms of the way they're treating stones and closing things off by the placement of stones, the immediate site context, and potentially we're not sure. We've potentially got two horizons of settlement. One horizon is 20 centimeters higher than the other one, and then we have a hemispherical arrangement of stake hole or post holes, which could be very similar to the structures they had at Lunt Meadow, or we could be misinterpreting that and we're just not seeing the top of the features, and they might be dug in from higher up. So we're trying to keep a very open mind to this without radiocarbon dates at the moment. But it's possible we have a hunter-gatherer building with then a very kind of insubstantial building superimposed on top of that, which is associated with carinated bolware pottery. But this is all up for grabs at the moment. We have to, and Alison, I know you're dying to come in, and I can just say one of the things we're struggling with, and it relates to the Midland questions earlier, is normally, as everyone knows, the Mesolithic settlements are characterized by huge amounts of lithic waste material. And what we're finding within our inverted commas Mesolithic sites underneath the inverted commas Neolithic site is there's very little cultural material. And we're struggling with that. We don't know whether that means it's not domestic or it's unusual, or they're just being meticulous in how they're selecting that material and redepositing it. So these are all questions at the moment, which I'm so frustrated about it. I just want to fast forward about 5 years and have the answers to this.
Not the only one.
Alison, did you have a...
I was just going to interject that it's not obligatory to find a rectangular structure in an early Neolithic context, because we have to bear in mind that there was a spectrum of habitational structures, and one of the most interesting aspects of your site is whether this was a sort of seasonal occupation in the early Neolithic. And if you think about the insubstantial structures, the triangular structures that Clive Waddington has picked up in Northumberland, or Oxfordarchaeology in Argyll, I mean, we know that Neolithic communities were doing transhumance. Yeah, and here in the context of the Salt Marsh, there's no reason why they shouldn't have been just staying here, on a seasonal basis. And that's why your work is so valuable in looking in great detail at the different, or at the depositional practices of the different levels to see whether there are consistencies or differences or what. Because the $64,000 question, as we said before in the previous session, is this two different groups and traditions of people, two genetically different people, or is it a case of hunter-gatherer fishers who then become acculturated and come back after an interval? So I really look forward to again, 5 years forward, but you're the best team to tackle this.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're starting to come to the end of our allotted time, but Steve Sherlock has a question, a general one for both Dick and the site, but maybe Alison and Alasdair more generally. Can you see any particular distinctive markers that indicate a toolkit of finds for this period at around 3800 BC?
Obviously, we've not done any work on the lithic assemblage, no analysis, detailed analysis as yet, and I can't wait to get started on that, to be honest. Like Fraser, I want to be 5 years in front, that would be brilliant. But we've got the usual diagnostic pieces, leaf-shaped arrowheads, variety of forms of leaf-shaped arrowheads, and we also have some early Bronze Age stuff as well. There is little bits and pieces of diagnostic material from other periods. And while we're on that point, let's not forget about the beaker burial up at the top with the lovely piece of archer's bracer in it. So we have that. There's quite a few blades. I've seen quite a few blades and what have you, suggesting again blade technology. We do have quite a few burins. I've managed to identify, just looking through stuff on site, that we've got quite a few burins turning up. But in saying that, from what I've seen so far, maybe tools. There might not be that many kicking about, but as I say, time will tell. Once we get into the analysis, we'll understand the technology a lot better. So just wait for that.
I don't know whether Alasdair or Alison have any more general comments on this period, or anyone else come to that.
I think in terms of characterizing similarities or differences between lithic traditions from the late Mesolithic to the early Neolithic, I know that Graham Warren did some very useful work on that, particularly as far as the Scottish material is concerned. But again, one of the greatest advantages of this site is that it's, if I'm right, it's one of the largest assemblages of early Neolithic lithics that you've got. And so this is going to be the site which will, I hope, help to give you some answers to these questions about to what extent, and also are there differences in different parts of Britain? Yeah, between late Mesolithic and earliest Neolithic lithic traditions.
Yeah, definitely. We need to think about that as well. Yeah, but you know, up in the northwest, supplies of quality materials are few and far between. So it's based on pebble flint, and working pebble flint is probably a lot different from what you get from the chalk and what have you. So there's that to take into consideration as well. You know, State Westby, it's started to give us a chance to look at those in details, and as you say, hopefully the further analysis of the stuff from the lithics from Windy Harbour will add to that. We've got a comparative bulk of data to work from as well from State and Western, so it's going to be really interesting.
And you've also got pitchstone.
Yes, we have got pitchstone. Yes, about 5 or 6 pieces, I think. So not as much as we had up at Stainton, but yes, pitchstone. And again, that going back to people and how they were moving about the landscape, they obviously had extensive contacts extending up the west coast, the Irish Sea Zone. So yes.
I mean, sorry, I'll be very quick. And just to say historically, Schiphol was a port, So where we are was actually in the 18th century, unfortunately, a port based on the Caribbean trade. So the river was navigable. So it would be an ideal place for people to set off on long distance voyages. There was a question earlier about whether, from somebody, about whether people potentially could have engaged in maritime travel, and the potential's there. And sorry, Alasdair.
Yeah,
no, I just, if I may, just wanted to comment very briefly publicly on something I'd emailed after the seminar, Fraser and Jill, about these questions of continuity and succession, and is it the same folks who, as it were, become Neolithic, or are they replaced? I'm not going to pronounce on the outcome. You know, don't rush till 5 years. Enjoy it, I say. Anyway, well, I was just going to draw it. We've had some mention of Denmark, but there are fascinating contexts to look at on the Dutch coasts and coming down into the Scheldt Valley in northern Belgium, where it looks like you have got very good evidence for acculturating hunter-gatherer populations. In specifically in the Dutch case, this is known as the Swifterband group. And on, I think, still up to date, but don't trust me, evidence, they seem to be sort of going through quite a slow process from the late 6th right through the 5th millennium, gradually getting Neolithic things and practices, to coin a phrase, pots, and then I forget the exact sequence, pigs, and then cattle, and then cereals. And you've got a series of wonderful sites, very reminiscent in many ways of Windy Harbour, Hardingsfeld and Bergschen Hook, and then eventually Shiploiden in the early 4th millennium, which looks much more sort of classically Neolithic, but they're still doing a lot of moving around a wetland near coastal environment. I mean, you might have a much more, I'm not saying it's, you know, Windy Harbour is Swifterband, but you might have, from what Fraser described, a much more accelerated timescale. But I'm sure Fraser, I think, is well aware of these. But you know, there might be something worthwhile pursuing there, catching up with Dutch colleagues on what the latest thinking there is. Just a thought. I think it's very interesting in a wider perspective.
Yeah,
that's right, Alistair. And also, I think we will be very much interested in talking to our own colleagues down who've been looking, like Mike Donnelly, etc., and obviously been looking at Bexhill. In Hastings is a big site we've had there, because I think they're sat on some potentially explosive evidence about the very late Mesolithic and Neolithic interactions, which I'll let them broker in due course.
Yeah, absolutely. We look forward to that. So we've got two last questions, and then unfortunately we probably have to finish. So the first of which is there any evidence of Middle Neolithic activity, and if so, what form does it take?
No.
Stop window, and then you don't have to answer what form.
Later Neolithic and obviously into the Bronze Age, yes. But as far as we know, there's nothing diagnostic in terms of lithics or workstone that we can probably associate with Middle Neolithic.
Okay,
and that's possibly interesting, because it's possibly due to changes in the landscape and hydrology as well. So.
Right, okay, yeah. And then Tom Lawrence from OA South says, as late 5th millennium sites become more common, Windy Harbour and Bexhill, how do you think the transition debate will change, if at all? Now, this is what we could talk for an hour on, but yeah, if you could, answers on a postcard would be good. I don't know who wants to, yes, a large and tricky question. Oh yeah, go on, Rick. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think what's really positive about the debate around the transition in the last 5 years is we've had so many different strands of evidence, and this is, you know, we're getting lots of new evidence from different new scientific processes which are giving us data that we wouldn't have imagined having 5 or 6 years ago. But I think also the fact that we're dealing here with big assemblages from areas which have been traditionally thought of as being backwaters or not having much to tell us about important periods like the transition. And now we've got what we thought we had a very good assemblage to deal with the transition at Stainton West, and this is in many ways much better in terms of the sequence. The Stainton West sequence is fantastic for the late Mesolithic, fantastic for the early Neolithic, but the point of transition is not as clear cut as it appears to be so far at Windy Harbour. So I think the fact that we're opening up to lots of different kinds of evidence is going to allow us to put everything in context, not to just, not to have a situation where we go with suddenly we've got a new strand of evidence and everything becomes about that new strand of evidence. It's going to be that we're starting to get exciting new evidence from a lot of different places all at once, and particularly the things we talked about earlier about environmental DNA and the potential of DNA work with cereals. Those are things that could really inform us. I was just thinking, this is not answering that question, this is thinking about something that I think Alison was saying earlier. Seren Griffiths, some modelling of serial date adoption, which I never saw beyond a bit of paper in her office, but that seemed to show that, and I think she probably presented it, and certainly in the Neolithic Studies group, that seemed to show that serial adoption was slightly later than the modelled start of the Neolithic in most regions. But my knowledge of that is stuck in my office at work, and I'm in.
Yeah. No, well, that's fantastic, and I think it's testimony to the site itself, the excavation, and the quality of the analysis, that these big questions are being raised, and clearly in your mythical 5 years' time, you won't provide us with the answer, I predict, but you will certainly throw considerable new light on the situation. So I'd just like to thank everyone involved, particularly the panelists and the people from OA, but also all the people who've sent in such a fantastic range of questions. I think both halves of this event, the presentation and this Q&A, have been extremely thought-provoking, and we're hoping possibly we won't have to wait for a full 5 years, but possibly in a couple of years or so we'll come back and see where the team's got to and discuss all these issues further.
Chris, before we go, could I just pick it? Sorry to cut across, but
go.
Yeah, we're very keen to keep sharing information and sharing the debate and building on what we've done here. But the problem with archaeological research is that it necessarily does take a long time, and we won't have completed this in 5 years. I very much doubt. It'll probably take longer, particularly if we want to sort of really draw on the full potential of the site and involve others in helping us kind of realize that. So and we're very open. Anyone who's interested in this and you feel we've got anything you can help us with, we're very open to collaborations. And I'll shut up and bye-bye. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone ever so much. It's been a really enlightening and exciting couple of encounters. So thank you all, and we'll sign off now and see each other again at some point in the future.
Bye.